Morning coffee drinkers, grab your strongest brew because today we're diving into the political equivalent of someone shouting fire in a crowded theatre, except instead of fire, it's Esther McVey declaring a state of emergency over channel crossings and demanding Parliament comes back from its holidays like a stern headteacher recalling students from summer break. We've hit 25,000 channel crossings this year, which is apparently enough to make former Conservative ministers start throwing around emergency declarations faster than a weather presenter during a mild breeze. And trust me, when politicians start using phrases like state of emergency, you know we're either facing genuine crisis or someone's been watching too many disaster movies and getting ideas. So let's unpack this delicious slice of political drama, shall we? Esther McVey, former Conservative minister and current voice of "Why aren't we panicking more about this?" has gone on GB News to essentially demand that every MP abandons their deck chairs and sangria to rush back to Westminster for an emergency session. It's giving serious mum calling everyone back inside because it started spitting with rain energy, except instead of a light drizzle, we're talking about migration statistics that have got certain politicians more worked up than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The numbers that have got McVey reaching for the parliamentary panic button show 24,538 people have made the crossing since January, pushing us toward that psychologically significant 25,000 milestone. That's a 47% increase from last year, which in political terms is the difference between concerning trend and everyone loses their minds. It's like watching your electricity bill increase by nearly half and then wondering why you're suddenly very interested in energy policy. But here's where McVey's intervention gets properly entertaining. She's not just calling for emergency sessions, she's basically demanding the government dust off the Rwanda scheme like it's a vintage wine that's been aging in the political cellar. Dust down the Rwanda plan immediately, she declared, because that is what Trump has based his scheme on and it has pretty much stopped all of the immigrants coming over the Mexican border. Now, I'm no expert on American immigration policy, but claiming Trump based his border strategy on Britain's Rwanda plan is like saying Gordon Ramsay learned to cook by watching me make beans on toast. It's technically possible, but probably not the most accurate assessment of cause and effect. The idea that Trump looked at Britain's Rwanda deportation scheme and thought now there's a policy I should copy is so beautifully backwards it almost deserves its own political comedy sketch. It's like claiming that America invented fish and chips after visiting Britain, rather than the other way around. The timeline might be a bit wobbly, and the logic definitely needs some work, but the confidence is absolutely unshakable. McVey's solution doesn't stop at reviving Rwanda either. She's also demanding Britain withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, because apparently the only way to solve immigration is to opt out of international agreements faster than a subscription service you forgot you signed up for. We've got to get out the European Convention on Human Rights and stop the Human Rights Act, she proclaimed, which is the political equivalent of solving traffic problems by removing all the traffic lights. Technically it might reduce some complications, but the resulting chaos might be worse than the original problem. The timing of this emergency declaration is particularly interesting because it comes just as fresh arrivals in Dover have been captured on camera, with Border Force vessels and RNLI lifeboats responding to multiple crossings throughout Wednesday afternoon. The visual of boats packed with life-jacketed passengers arriving in Dover Harbor certainly makes for dramatic television, which is probably not entirely coincidental given that McVey made her emergency declaration on a news channel that thrives on dramatic political statements. What's fascinating about these numbers is how they're being presented. 25,000 sounds absolutely massive until you remember that England and Wales added over 700,000 residents last year, with net migration accounting for nearly 700,000 of that increase. It's like focusing intensely on the dripping tap while ignoring the burst pipe in the basement. The channel crossings are certainly visible and dramatic, but they're actually a relatively small part of the overall immigration picture. The broader immigration context reveals some properly eye-watering figures that make the channel crossings look like a statistical rounding error. England and Wales experienced their second-largest annual population increase in 75 years, with over 1 million people entering while 452,000 departed. That's like an entire city's worth of people moving in, except instead of building new infrastructure, we're mostly just arguing about the few thousand who arrived by boat. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has been busy pointing fingers at the previous government's failed open borders experiment, claiming it resulted in net migration quadrupling to almost 1 million per year in 2023. It's the political equivalent of inheriting a house where the previous owners left the windows open during a storm and then spending your time complaining about the water damage instead of actually fixing anything. Sure, you've correctly identified who's responsible, but the carpet's still soaking wet. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged stricter immigration controls, including prohibiting overseas care worker recruitment and implementing enhanced English language requirements. It's like trying to solve a housing crisis by making the application forms more difficult to fill out. Technically, it might reduce numbers, but it doesn't address whether you actually need the workers or have alternative solutions. The political psychology behind emergency declarations is absolutely fascinating. McVey's demand for an immediate parliamentary recall suggests that 25,000 channel crossings represent some sort of critical threshold that requires dropping everything and convening emergency sessions. But here's the thing about political emergencies, they're often more about political positioning than actual crisis management. It's like declaring a family emergency because you've run out of milk, then demanding everyone cancel their plans to discuss the dairy shortage. What makes this particularly amusing is that Parliament's summer recess exists partly so MPs can spend time in their constituencies, theoretically staying in touch with the very people they're supposed to represent. But McVey's essentially arguing that the situation is so urgent that MPs need to abandon their local engagement to come back to Westminster and argue about solutions they've been debating for years. It's like calling a family meeting to discuss the same argument you had at Christmas, except now it's supposedly more urgent because the calendar's changed. The comparison to Trump's border policies adds another layer of surreal political logic to McVey's argument. She's essentially claiming that Britain should copy policies that were supposedly copied from British policies in the first place, which creates a feedback loop of policy inspiration that makes about as much sense as a hall of mirrors designed by someone who's never heard of physics. If Trump really did base his approach on Rwanda, and we should copy Trump's approach, then we're basically photocopying a photocopy and expecting the quality to improve. The European Convention on Human Rights withdrawal demand is particularly telling because it reveals the underlying frustration with legal constraints on government action. McVey's essentially arguing that the best way to deal with human rights complications is to opt out of human rights altogether, which is like solving parking problems by abolishing the concept of parking spaces. Technically, you eliminate the regulatory framework, but you might create bigger problems in the process. What's missing from this emergency declaration is any serious discussion of why people are making these dangerous crossings in the first place, or what sustainable long-term solutions might look like. McVey's approach is essentially shut everything down and send everyone away, which has the appealing simplicity of a toddler solution to sharing toys but might not work quite as well in the real world of international relations and humanitarian obligations. The Dover arrivals continue despite governmental attempts at deterrence and diplomatic engagement with French authorities, which suggests that simply declaring emergencies and recalling Parliament might not actually solve the underlying issues. It's like trying to stop rain by shouting at clouds, emotionally satisfying perhaps, but practically limited in its effectiveness. So there you have it, Esther McVey's call for emergency action on channel crossings, complete with demands for parliamentary recalls, Rwanda scheme revival, and human rights opt-outs. It's British politics at its most dramatically reactive, where crossing statistical thresholds triggers calls for constitutional changes and international agreement withdrawals. Whether any of this actually addresses the complex realities of global migration patterns is another question entirely. Keep that coffee strong and your sense of proportion intact, because when politicians start declaring emergencies over statistics, you know we're in for a wild ride of proposed solutions that are probably more dramatic than the problems they're meant to solve. Don't forget to subscribe to UK Daily Coffee, because tomorrow's political overreactions are brewing as we speak, and trust me, they're going to need more caffeine than a university student cramming for finals. Until then, remember that in British politics, the difference between a concerning trend and a national emergency is often just a matter of which politician's talking and how dramatically they want to make their point.